Have you considered a series of quilts to develop a design idea? Let's talk. Hi, I'm Roberta from Quilt Crafters Corner, and today I want to talk about making that series of quilts that develop a design idea that you've been working on. Now, this first came to me in an idea to use up some low volume crumbs that I had, and I saw lots of applique pieces that had a low volume background that were collaged. And when it's collaged, there's a lot of raw edge on it, and I wanted them to be more finished. So I took my low volume crumbs and developed them into crumbs, what we call crumb squares, and it's making fabric out of little pieces of fabric. And so when I did this, I had lots of low volume crumbs that I put together as my background. The background came together with 70 6.5-inch crumb squares. So let's take a look at the first quilt that I made with the teddy bear applique on it. Now the first quilt has 70 6.5-inch squares, and these are all low volume crumbs that were put into crumb squares that developed the background. And I knew I needed something light enough for the teddy bear applique to stand out. And so that's why this worked out really well for me. It just, it came together rather quickly. So these don't need to be made in 6.5-inch squares. These could easily be made into 12.5-inch squares and put together. And this is 4 rows across and 5 rows down. So this is a fairly good sized quilt. Now the second quilt that I put together that was with the teddy bear applique had the same principle, but I wanted to do half light and half dark and get that idea of a lighter area for the applique to sit on so that you could see it. It wouldn't show up on the darker crumb squares. So I developed the idea of a diagonal. So let's take a look at the diagonal teddy bear quilt. So as you can see, I did a zigzag pattern that goes down the edge of the quilt. And I did this only so that I had enough area for the teddy bear to sit in and enough interest with the colors up to bring some life to the quilt so that it had some depth to it. You have the teddy bear down in the corner, and you have the darker crumb squares up in the opposite corner. And I was really pleased with the way this turned out, and I started to play with this idea of half low volume and half dark crumb squares. My first thought on the diagonal pattern was how I was going to do this, and it just worked out that the zigzag really brought this quilt more to life. The layout of this quilt is 4 6.5-inch crumb squares, so I had to figure out where my lights would go and where my darks would go in order to make this work. So the layout on this was pretty important once I got it done and laid out, and this quilt really did come to life rather quickly. The third quilt was a little bit more difficult because I was working more vertically. I wanted to do a low volume and a dark, but with that vertical line. And when I first laid it on the design wall, that line between the low and the dark was too abrupt, and it just didn't look right. So what I ended up doing is I ended up doing a pattern where they kind of went into each other. They kind of blocked over into the next one. So let's take a look at this quilt. Now this quilt, like I said, I had a very distinct line down the middle, and it was just too abrupt. It just made it was too shocking to the eye. So I had to tone it down And in order to do that, I just brought some of those darker crumb squares over into the lights so that I have this, light, dark, light, dark, light, dark effect going all the way down the length of the quilt. And with the teddy bears going on the side there to follow that same pattern. So this worked out really well because I had these smaller ones that I just appliqued down. Now these were appliqued down with heat and bond, and then a heavy satin stitch around the edge to hold them down really well, because these quilts are intended for heavy use. So all of these quilts, the teddy bears were appliqued down so that they would, stay and hold their shape. Now let's talk a little bit about why I did a series of quilts all very similar. And the idea comes from artists, and it's called a study in a series, and being whatever modality the artist is working in, whether it's paint or sculpture or clay or whatever. And this is really to open up and explore different aspects of an idea, to kind of work with it and get an idea of what it looks like. It's actually to create new ideas. Once I started with the total low volume background, and then I went to the diagonal, and then I went to the vertical, and actually there's a fourth one in this series that's not quilted yet, but stick around, I will show it soon. And it has a whole nother element to it. So this just broadens your horizon in giving you ideas, giving your mind an idea, and then starting to work with it and develop new ideas. And this just makes, at least for me, it makes for a more interesting quilt. I always evaluate, what did I learn from this quilt? What is it that worked? What didn't work? Or what I liked, what I didn't like. This is all part of being an artist and a quilter. Putting these ideas together and seeing what works and what doesn't work, and then taking the next step. What's the next step? What's the next easy thing that I can do with this to make this work? So growth of mind in your quilting just makes you a better quilter. It gives you a element of things to think about and look at, and do I like that? Or maybe, I like this better. Changing things up, evaluating what you've done, and just learning, constantly learning new things. If you're not learning new things, your mind's not growing. So I highly encourage you to try this technique. Take your low volume crumbs, make a background, and applique it on something. If you need ideas for applique, leave me a comment down below. I would love to help you with this. This is something that I find really interesting and really fascinating. If you like this video, please like it and leave me a comment. I would love to know if you try this. Come back and comment later. Please subscribe if you haven't subscribed already. And until the next time, keep quilting.